In a room built for titans, the architect of the old world finally met the wrecking ball she had spent a lifetime dismissing, a hillbilly with a Yale degree and the vice presidency. The air inside the sprawling Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room immediately thickened, growing dense with a kind of volatile, crackling political electricity that precedes a seismic shift in American history. This highly anticipated gathering centered ostensibly on foreign policy and institutional reform, had been meticulously orchestrated as a grand valedictory lap for Hillary Rodham Clinton, a farewell performance meant to unequivocally cement her influence on the global stage. The committee members addressed for a coronation, fully expecting the weighty gravitas and polished statesmanship that naturally accompanied a former Secretary of State sharing her vast institutional knowledge. But what the committee received instead was the final, fatal political miscalculation of Clinton's sprawling four-decade career. Vice President J.D. Vance, occupying his constitutional role as President of the Senate, sat silently on the elevated wooden dais. It was a highly unusual maneuver for a sitting vice president to attend a committee hearing in this manner, but constitutional protocol strictly permitted it, and Vance had made his intentions explicitly clear to the chairman beforehand. The very architecture of the imposing room foreshadowed the impending collision long before a single microphone was turned on. Clinton sat at the witness table down below, bathed in the harsh glare of the C-SPAN lighting, forced to physically look upward. Vance sat perched high above, looking down with the stoic, unreadable posture of a man deeply familiar with adversity. The visual optics were profoundly jarring. The woman who had once navigated the West Wing as if the building itself had been architecturally designed around her, the most powerful, unelected figure in American politics, who had stood rigid in the Situation Room during the bin Laden raid, was now looking up at a boy from Middletown, Ohio. He was a man from a rusted-out town she had never once visited, someone who had clawed his way out of a trailer park with a mother cycling through rehab, joined the United States Marine Corps at 18, graduated from Yale Law School, and somehow ascended to become the second most powerful person in the nation. He was from a community she had casually dismissed as entirely irredeemable. Yet here he was, not just a survivor, but the man who had quite literally written the book on making it out, a book specifically about the exact people she had so callously labeled. When Clinton finally leaned into her microphone, her opening statement unfolded as 7 uninterrupted minutes of exquisitely polished demolition. She delivered her remarks precisely the way she delivered everything, straight from a meticulously prepared text, her voice carrying the practiced, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned diplomat who would address the United Nations General Assembly, testify before endless congressional committees, and debated on the world's biggest presidential stages. Her tone was dripping with the supreme, unshakable authority of someone who had been rehearsing for these exact mahogany-lined rooms since her days at Wellesley College. Mr. Vice President, I appreciate the committee's invitation to share institutional knowledge about American foreign policy, but I must note with some concern that the current administration's approach represents a fundamental departure from decades of bipartisan consensus. She began, her gaze locking onto Vance. It was the piercing, arrogant look of a woman who had spent 40 years comfortably reigning as the most credentialed person in every room she entered, completely unadjusted to the shocking reality of facing someone entirely unimpressed by her resume. She aggressively reminded the chamber of her distinguished past, noting how she had served alongside Joe Biden during the operation that brought Osama bin Laden to justice and collaborated with Al Gore on sweeping global climate agreements. These were men, she emphasized heavily, possessing decades of rigorous foreign policy experience, men who had dedicated their entire careers to studying the intricate architecture of international relations. Then her voice shifted gears, taking on that devastatingly practiced modulation she had perfected long ago, the unique ability to deliver lethal insults wrapped securely in a veneer of measured, motherly concern. You, Mr. Vice President, wrote a memoir about growing up in poverty in Ohio. She stated, her lips curling into a tight, patronizing smile. A compelling story. But a compelling story is not a qualification for managing America's role in the world. You've been in government for less time than some of my interns served in the State Department. She leaned forward slightly, closing in for what she clearly believed would be the decisive kill. I've read the commentary suggesting that people like me, people who've spent their lives in public service, are somehow the problem, that the solution is to hand power to outsiders who've never managed anything more complex than a Senate office. I understand the appeal of that narrative. It's the same narrative that convinced enough people in enough states that experience was a liability and celebrity was a qualification. She let a highly theatrical pause hang in the silent room, the distinct hesitation of a political veteran deciding to utter a line she inherently knew would dominate the evening news cycle, deciding the headline was well worth the cruelty. But with respect, Mr. Vice President, being from Appalachia doesn't make you a foreign policy expert any more than being from Chappaqua makes me a coal miner, she declared coldly. You were elected on a promise of change. From where I sit, the change looks a lot like inexperience dressed up in populist clothing. You are a deplorable in a nice suit, and a nice suit doesn't change what's underneath. She leaned back into her plush leather chair, projecting the supreme composure of an apex predator that had just executed a flawless, fatal strike. Sustained, deliberate applause immediately erupted from the Democratic side of the dais, breaking the suffocating tension. A CNN chyron instantly flashed onto millions of screens. Clinton confronts Vance on qualifications. Within seconds, a progressive commentator fired off a tweet declaring, Hillary just ended this man's career in one sentence, a post that rapidly accumulated 6,000 retweets before Vance even took his first breath to formulate a response. Throughout the blistering verbal assault, Vance had remained entirely motionless. He sat back with the relaxed, almost casually observant body language of a man born in a rusted-out town where telegraphing one's emotions through physical posture was a highly dangerous luxury. When the partisan applause finally sputtered and died, he did not rush to the microphone to interrupt or object. Instead, he let 3 heavy, agonizing seconds of dead silence hang in the air. It was not a dramatically contrived pause, but rather the calculated silence of a survivor who weighed his words carefully, treating them as finite currency because in Middletown, you simply did not spend your words recklessly. Slowly, a smile crept across his face. It was that slight, disarming Midwest nice smile that any political opponent who had ever debated J.D. Vance would instantly recognize with sheer dread a polite facade perfectly concealing a surgically precise blade. Madam Secretary, thank you, Vance began, his voice completely unhurried and conversational. You covered a lot of ground. My background, my qualifications, my suit. He casually reached up and adjusted his silk tie. This is actually my second nice suit. My first one I bought at Goodwill for $12 for a job interview my senior year. I remember the exact price because I counted the money 3 times before I paid. The room grew uncomfortably still as he locked eyes with the former First Lady. Where I come from, $12 was a decision. $12 meant something else you couldn't buy that week. His tone remained steady, entirely stripped of any artificial Washington pretense. You said being from Appalachia doesn't make me a foreign policy expert. You're right. What makes me qualified is the same thing that made me qualified for every job I've ever held. I did the work. Marine Corps, Yale Law, United States Senate, Vice Presidency. I didn't inherit any of those. I earned them, each one from the bottom. He leaned forward, resting his forearm squarely on the polished desk. But you're also right about something else, Madam Secretary. I am deplorable, or at least that's what you called people like me. He let the deeply loaded word marinate in the silence. You called my community, coal miners, veterans, factory workers, people who pray and own guns and work with their hands, a basket of deplorables. His eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle flash of unbreakable steel beneath the polite demeanor. You said it at a fundraiser with Barbra Streisand at a party that cost more per plate than my grandmother made in a month. So yes, I'm deplorable. I've been deplorable my whole life. The difference between 2016 and today is that the deplorable is sitting up here and you're sitting down there. With fluid, unhurried grace, Vance reached over and opened a simple, unembossed manila folder. It entirely lacked a presidential seal. It looked exactly like something hastily purchased from a discount office supply store back in Middletown, Ohio, because it probably did. He spoke in the engaging, hypnotic tone of a man sharing an intimate, everyday story over black coffee, a story that just happened to contain the thermonuclear evidence required to obliterate a political dynasty forever. Now, let's talk about your record, he said softly. Madam Secretary, you used the word deplorable at a fundraiser in 2016. I want to put it in context. Not your context, the context of the people you were talking about. He glanced down at the stark white paper, September 9th, 2016, an LGBT fundraiser at Cipriani in New York City. Barbra Streisand performed. Tickets started at $1,200 and went up to $250,000 per table. He looked directly into her eyes, ensuring she felt the full, suffocating weight of the economic contrast. And from that room, surrounded by donors whose net worth exceeded the GDP of some of the counties I grew up near, you said you could put half of Trump's supporters into what you called the basket of deplorables. Racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. Vance's voice tightened with a deeply personal, barely restrained emotional resonance. My grandmother, the woman who raised me while my mother was in rehab, voted for Donald Trump. He declared, painting a vivid, unvarnished picture of the raw Rust Belt reality. Mama was a high school graduate. She worked at Armco Steel until her body couldn't take it anymore. She went to church on Sundays. She owned a gun because the neighborhood wasn't safe, and the police took 20 minutes to arrive. He tapped the table rhythmically to emphasize his biting words. She worried about the future because the factory was closing and the pills were coming, and she could see what was happening to her family and her town, and nobody in Washington seemed to notice or care. His gaze felt heavy, drilling mercilessly into the witness table. And according to you, she was deplorable, irredeemable, a word you used, Madam Secretary, irredeemable, not misguided, not mistaken, irredeemable, beyond saving. You wrote off my grandmother from a fundraiser that cost more than her annual income. Without waiting for a reaction, Vance sharply turned the page. March 2016, CNN Town Hall. You said, and this is a direct quote, "We're going to put a lot of coal miners and coal companies out of business." The silence in the room became absolutely suffocating. You said it on national television to the faces of people whose families had been mining coal for generations. Coal miners, Madam Secretary, the people who went underground every morning not knowing if they'd come back up. The people whose lungs turned black so America could keep the lights on. The people who washed coal dust off their faces and went home to families that depended on their paychecks. He leaned closer to the microphone, his tone carrying a profound, devastating Midwestern grief. You went on national television and told them you were going to end their livelihood, not transition it, not help them find new work first. End it. He gestured toward his own chest. I grew up with those families. I played with their kids. I ate dinner at their tables. I saw what happened when the plants closed and the mines shut down. First, the jobs disappeared, then the hope, then the opioids arrived to fill the space where the hope had been. Then the funerals. Vance systematically flipped to the next sheet of paper, transforming into a relentless prosecutor, outlining a damning timeline of elite hypocrisy. And then earlier, 1,996. Before you called working-class white Americans deplorable, you called young black Americans super predators. Your exact words, "We need to bring them to heel," the language of dog training applied to black teenagers. He set the page down with a sharp, decisive slap against the wood. 3 quotes. 3 different groups of Americans. Black teenagers in 1996, coal miners in 2016, Trump voters in 2016. His voice was a steady, inescapable drumbeat of ultimate accountability. Same woman, same tone, same fundraiser circuits where the champagne cost more than a month's rent in Middletown. This isn't a gaffe, Madam Secretary. 1 quote is a gaffe. 2 quotes is a pattern. 3 quotes spanning 20 years is a worldview. His eyes locked firmly on hers, completely unwavering. And the worldview is people who don't look like your donors, don't talk like your donors, and don't write checks like your donors are something less than fully human. Where I come from, we have a word for that kind of thinking. We call it snobbery. Clinton's face remained frozen in that famously impenetrable political mask, but a subtle tightening around her jawline betrayed the astronomical mounting pressure. But snobbery usually doesn't destroy communities. Vance continued ruthlessly. Yours did. The coal communities you promised to shut down, they shut down. The opioid crisis that filled the vacuum, it filled it. The funerals I attended as a teenager for people my age, for overdoses that wouldn't have happened if the jobs had stayed, those funerals happened. His voice softened again, invoking a ghost that hung heavily over the devastating proceedings. My grandmother, Mama, she saw it coming. She couldn't have told you what GDP meant or explained monetary policy, but she could look out her window on McKinley Street and count the houses going dark one by one. Families leaving, families falling apart, families dying. The vice president's words painted a bleak, undeniable masterpiece of absolute Rust Belt despair. She could count them because she knew every family on the street by name, which is something that happens when you've lived in the same community for 50 years instead of commuting between fundraisers. He let the horrific imagery settle violently over the room. You called her deplorable from a room where the centerpieces cost more than her medication. She died before she could see me become vice president, but she saw enough to know that the woman calling her irredeemable had never once set foot in Middletown, Ohio. Down at the witness table, Clinton's tightly controlled smile had narrowed into a thin, highly brittle line. It was the pained expression of a stateswoman who had endured decades of professional cross-examinations without once losing her composure, only to find herself thoroughly, publicly dismantled by a man who had emerged directly from the very dirt she had so publicly scoffed at. Suddenly, the frequency of Vance's voice changed entirely. Madam Secretary, let's discuss classified information. This is a subject I have some personal experience with. He didn't raise his volume, nor did he adopt a physically aggressive posture. Instead, his tone dropped into a rigid, quiet cadence, a jarring shift from a Midwestern storyteller to a battle-hardened Marine operating on absolute military bearing. It was the solemn, terrifying voice of a man who intimately understood the crushing gravity of taking an oath, because the consequences of breaking it were not abstract for someone who had served alongside men who adhered to the rules, even when those rules meant certain death. I served in the United States Marine Corps, Vance stated flatly. During my service, I handled classified material, not at the level you handled it. You were Secretary of State and I was enlisted, but the rules are the same. The rules are actually more strict for enlisted personnel because enlisted Marines don't have lawyers and political connections to explain away their mistakes. He locked eyes with the former top diplomat of the United States. So I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it from the perspective of every service member who has ever handled classified information. If a lance corporal in the Marine Corps took classified documents home, stored them on a personal server in his basement, running through a commercial internet provider accessible to anyone with basic hacking capability, and when investigators asked for those documents, he deleted 33,000 of them and used military-grade deletion software called BleachBit to make sure they could never be recovered. What would happen to that lance corporal? Vance paused, not for theatrical effect, but because the answer was profoundly ugly and inherently understood by millions. I'll tell you what would happen because I served with men and women who knew exactly what the consequences were. That Lance Corporal would be court-martialed. He would lose his security clearance. He would receive a dishonorable discharge, which, for anyone who hasn't served, is the military equivalent of a felony conviction. It follows you for life. It affects your ability to vote, to own a firearm, to find employment, and depending on the severity, he would likely serve time at Leavenworth. The intensity radiating from the dais was absolutely palpable, a blistering heat born from rigid military discipline, violently confronting elite political immunity. I knew Marines who were disciplined for far less, for leaving a classified document on a desk overnight, for discussing classified material on an unsecured phone call, for carrying a briefing folder into the wrong room. The military takes classified information seriously because classified information is measured in lives, the lives of the men and women in the field whose missions depend on that information remaining secure. His voice grew sharper, cutting through the silence like a jagged scalpel. Now, let's talk about what you did. He read cleanly from his meticulously arranged notes. You maintained a private email server in your home in Chappaqua, New York, not a government server. A personal server in your basement set up by a private contractor. He detailed the damning timeline, noting she had sent and received highly classified information whose exposure could compromise ongoing operations and massively endanger human assets. When investigators asked for your emails, you turned over roughly 30,000. You deleted approximately 33,000 others, claiming they were personal yoga routines and Chelsea's wedding planning. The terrifying precision of the facts was suffocating the room. Then your staff used BleachBit, a forensic-grade deletion tool specifically designed to prevent data recovery to ensure those deleted emails could never be retrieved. When a reporter asked you whether you had wiped the server, you said, and I want to be precise because this quote will follow you for the rest of your career. What, like with a cloth or something? Vance allowed the sheer, breathtaking absurdity of her infamous excuse to hang heavily in the sterile congressional air. FBI Director James Comey investigated your server and found 110 emails containing classified information at the time they were sent or received. He called your handling, his exact words, extremely careless. He found evidence suggesting that hostile actors had likely accessed your server, and yet he recommended no charges. He methodically turned another page, revealing the devastating findings from Senator Grassley's 2,025 declassified documents that proved the FBI had entirely abandoned its duty, failing to even thoroughly examine thumb drives containing classified material, including sensitive messages from President Barack Obama himself. So here is my question, Madam Secretary, and it's a simple one, Vance demanded, leaning slightly over the microphone. A Lance Corporal who did what you did would be in military prison right now. He wouldn't be testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He wouldn't be collecting speaking fees. He wouldn't be offering foreign policy advice to anyone. He would be in a cell at Fort Leavenworth. He leveled his final, inescapable judgment. What is the difference between that Lance Corporal and you? Because from where I sit, from Middletown, Ohio, where people go to prison for possessing drugs that your donors' pharmaceutical companies manufactured, the only difference I can identify is the last name. Down below him, Clinton reached up with perfectly manicured fingers, removed her glasses, and carefully wiped them with a cloth she kept securely beside her water glass. It was a calculated 5-second delay tactic, practically mastered by political elites who intimately understood that cleaning eyewear bought precious cognitive processing time without appearing overtly evasive. Before she could even replace her glasses, Vance smoothly transitioned. Madam Secretary, let's discuss Haiti. He slipped seamlessly back into the conversational Midwestern storytelling rhythm, a tone that falsely promised safety right before inflicting maximum damage. This was not merely legal exposure, this was moral exposure, the devastating kind that left permanent, unhealable scars on a legacy. After the 2010 earthquake killed up to 300,000 Haitians and displaced over 1 million people, the international community pledged billions in aid. The United States alone dispersed approximately $4.4 billion, Vance recounted smoothly. Your husband, President Clinton, co-chaired the interim Haiti Recovery Commission. The Clinton Foundation raised tens of millions. You, as Secretary of State, oversaw State Department contracts for the reconstruction. He looked down at the devastating Department of Justice audit formally conducted in 2025. The DOJ audit found the following. Of the $4.4 billion the United States spent on Haiti, less than 2% of contracts went to Haitian companies. 56% went to firms located in or near Washington, D.C. He described the much publicized Caracol Industrial Park, heavily promoted with a flashy gala ceremony featuring Sean Penn and endless champagne, a facility that promised 100,000 robust jobs, but tragically only delivered slightly over 5,000, violently evicting hundreds of poor, vulnerable Haitian farmers from their sacred land in the process. Then he delivered the kill shot regarding the housing initiative. The housing initiative, $90 million specifically allocated for permanent shelter for displaced Haitians, resulted in 6 permanent homes, Vance said, letting the horrific number echo in the vast hall. 6. In a country where over 1 million people were living in tent cities, $90 million divided by 6 homes is $15 million per home, the most expensive public housing in human history. Except the people who needed the housing never received it. The vice president aggressively outlined how internal State Department emails obtained via Freedom of Information Act requests revealed a grotesque system of prioritization where Friends of Bill, FOB, and WJC VIPs received preferential, fast-tracked attention, treating the devastated, grieving nation like a lucrative playground for political allies. The people of Haiti, the people who had lost everything, who were living under tarps in the rain, who were watching their children get sick from cholera because the water systems hadn't been rebuilt, received promises, Vance said bitterly. He highlighted the grotesque financial arithmetic. Creating a factory job paying $2,000 a year had inexplicably cost $55,000 per job, all while the Clinton Foundation simultaneously pumped $2 million into building the Royal Oasis Hotel, complete with $200 a night rooms, designer purses in the gift shop, and pristine hardwood floors in the suites. The Washington Post reported the hotel appeared largely empty. A luxury hotel empty in a country where the minimum wage is 30 cents an hour, built with money that was supposed to rebuild homes. Vance closed the folder, entirely setting it aside, relying purely on raw, unscripted conviction. Madam Secretary, I grew up in poverty, not Haitian poverty, American poverty, Appalachian poverty, the kind you told Anderson Cooper you were going to fix by putting coal miners out of business. He shook his head, his voice dripping with barely suppressed righteous fury. But poverty is poverty. The arithmetic is the same everywhere in the world. Poverty means choosing between medicine and heat. Poverty means your mother's addiction isn't an emotional crisis. First, it's a financial crisis because rehab costs money and the electricity bill doesn't wait. Poverty means wearing the same shoes until the soles wear through and then putting cardboard inside because new shoes aren't in the budget. His eyes burned into Clinton's skull. Haiti after the earthquake, that was my neighborhood with palm trees. Same broken promises, same powerful people flying in for photo ops and flying out with contracts. Same poor people left holding rubble while the money disappeared into organizations that existed to help them, but somehow never did. You built a luxury hotel, the Royal Oasis, in a nation where people were still living under tarps 3 years after the earthquake. $200 a night in a country where $200 is 6 months of wages. He leveled a devastating accusation that shattered the room. Where I come from, Madam Secretary, where the deplorables come from, taking money meant for disaster relief and building a luxury hotel isn't called charity. It's called a grift. The word hung violently in the air. And where I come from, we know exactly what grifts look like because we've been on the receiving end of them our entire lives. The only difference between the grifts in Middletown and the grifts in Haiti is the number of zeros and the quality of the champagne. At the witness table, Hillary Clinton desperately reached across the expanse of polished wood and wrapped her fingers around her water glass, the exact same steady hand that had once confidently signed international treaties with foreign governments, held the presidential Bible, and shaken hands with every world leader for 2 decades. She lifted the glass to her lips and took a painfully long, deliberate 4-second sip, desperate to fill the deafening silence with motion, hiding her complete lack of a coherent response behind a thin, pathetic veil of hydration. Thousands of miles away, the catastrophic ripples of this absolute dismantling were hitting the American heartland like a physical shockwave. In a bleak, fluorescent-lit break room of an Amazon delivery station nestled deep in Middletown, Ohio, just 6 blocks from the very house where J.D. Vance had grown up, 6 blocks that might as well have been 6 inches, given how tightly the neighborhood held its people. A 62-year-old man named Tommy Blankenship sat glued to the blurry screen of his smartphone, watching history brutally unfold live. Tommy was a walking ghost of the American industrial collapse. He had spent 19 grueling years sweating at Armco Steel, the identical plant where Mama Vance had broken her body, a massive facility that had once sustained the entire town before its devastating closure triggered the catastrophic cascade that birthed a tragic wave of opioid obituaries. When the economic crash arrived violently in 2008, it took his job and his wife Donna's health simultaneously, an apocalyptic financial collision that only deep poverty can truly manufacture. After 4 agonizing years of unemployment and watching medical bills accumulate like snow, Tommy now drove a truck for Amazon, wearing faded safety-toe boots and worn-out work pants that had grown incredibly soft from years of back-breaking labor, aggressively packing boxes for $14 an hour and bitterly pretending it was somehow equivalent to forging American steel. When Clinton sneered the words deplorable in a nice suit, Tommy had instinctively looked down at his own heavily soiled uniform in disgust. But when Vance proudly spoke of his $12 Goodwill suit, a profound nod of absolute recognition escaped Tommy's lips. He knew that exact Goodwill on Main Street. It was where his own mother had purchased his back-to-school clothes, the sole retail lifeline for a town violently drowning in despair. That kid grew up 6 blocks from my house, Tommy muttered to Diego, his bewildered 26-year-old co-driver, who had never even heard of Middletown before being assigned to the miserable delivery route. 6 blocks. Same schools, same Goodwill, same deplorable. Later that evening, inside a dilapidated living room where the fireplace hadn't functioned since 2014 because simple repairs simply weren't in the budget, Tommy's wife Donna stared intently at their small flat-screen TV. "That Mama Vance's grandson?" she asked softly. "That's him? The kid everybody thought would end up like his mama?" Tommy paused, the massive weight of the incredible moment swelling aggressively in his chest. "He didn't end up like his mama," Tommy replied with fierce, unyielding pride. "He ended up like his grandma." Concurrently, deep within the humid expanse of Little Haiti in Miami, Florida, where the heavy scent of griot lingered beautifully in the air, and Creole prayers drifted from the desperate churches, the agonizing echo of Vance's arithmetic was breaking hearts all over again. Inside the sterile break room of Jackson Memorial Hospital, a 38-year-old exhausted registered nurse named Marie Claire Duval tightly gripped her phone. Her immigrant parents had lost their home in the horrific Port-au-Prince earthquake, enduring 3 soul-crushing years, trapped beneath rotting tarps in a squalid tent city, waiting desperately for the glorious American aid that merely manifested as elite press conferences and zero housing. When Vance weaponized the horrific statistics, $4.4 billion, yielding a pathetic 6 homes, Marie Claire set her phone down and immediately dialed her 64-year-old mother, Josette, who was busy scrubbing luxury hotel rooms in Miami Beach for a mere fraction of what her wealthy guests paid for a single night's stay. Man switched to C-SPAN. Marie Claire urged urgently in Creole, "Someone is talking about us." Josette switched the channel, leaning heavily on her mop. While her grasp of English was largely functional, practically confined to the subservient vocabulary required to clean up after wealthy strangers, the terrifying math required absolutely no translation. $4.4 billion. 6 homes, Josette whispered in profound shock. "C'est que," she repeated numbly in Creole. 6 houses. A heavy, suffocating silence spanned the phone line, a silence perfectly built on 15 agonizing years of elite betrayal. "You te dis nous," Josette murmured, her voice breaking softly. They told us they would help." Marie Claire wiped a stray tear, fully knowing her next patient, an uninsured Haitian diabetic, was waiting before returning to the brutal reality of the emergency room, glancing back at her phone to see Clinton utterly paralyzed on screen. Back in the suffocating tension of the Senate hearing room, Vance's voice descended once more, dropping completely into the reverent, hushed register utilized exclusively by military personnel when discussing their sacred fallen brethren. His pacing slowed deliberately, matching the somber cadence of a funeral march. "Madam Secretary, I need to discuss Benghazi," he announced quietly. "I want to be careful because 4 Americans died, and their deaths are not a political talking point. They are a fact that deserves precision." He meticulously recited the horrific events of September 11th, 2012, formally entering the sacred names of Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and heroic CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty directly into the congressional record, violently refusing to let them be reduced to mere historical statistics. 4 Americans, 4 names that I want, entered into this hearing's record with the weight they deserve. Vance expertly outlined the agonizing months preceding the deadly attack, detailing the more than 600 frantic, heavily documented requests for enhanced security, traversing up the State Department's chain of command as Libyan conditions rapidly deteriorated. He aggressively highlighted the massive warning signs, the bombings, the British withdrawal, the absolute departure of the Red Cross. "When the Red Cross leaves, Madam Secretary, that is not a subtle signal," Vance said with icy precision. "That is the international community telling you that a location has become untenable." Despite every other Western entity fleeing, the American compound inexplicably remained open, and those 600 desperately ignored security requests terminated squarely on Clinton's mahogany desk. The vice president vividly reconstructed the brutal 13-hour firefight, specifically praising former Navy SEAL Tyrone Woods, who heroically defied cowardly bureaucratic orders to stand down. Woods had stormed the diplomatic compound, dragged wounded Americans to safety, and heroically taken an exposed defensive posture on a rooftop. He painted a target with a laser designator, a device that identifies enemy positions for incoming air support, Vance recounted, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of awe and suppressed rage. He pointed that laser at the mortar teams that were attacking his position. He held that laser steady for hours, waiting for air support, waiting for the jets or the gunships or the quick reaction force that the laser was designed to summon. The laser was his end of the contract, his signal that said, "I am here. I have identified the threat. I need help. The room was dead silent, entirely hypnotized by the graphic recounting of the ultimate betrayal. He held up his end. The air support never came. Tyrone Woods was killed by a mortar strike in the early morning hours. He died on a rooftop in Libya, holding a laser designator pointed at the people who were killing him, waiting for help from the country he served. Vance locked a deadly gaze onto Clinton. During the Senate hearing in January 2013, when Senator Ron Johnson pressed you on the circumstances surrounding the attack, your response was, "What difference at this point does it make?" The vice president stopped abruptly. He was no longer speaking as a polished politician. He was speaking as an enlisted Marine whose blood literally boiled at the betrayal of the sacred military pact. Madam Secretary, I served alongside men like Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, he declared forcefully. The men who are always the last to leave, the men who run toward gunfire when every rational instinct says run away, the men who understand that the mission doesn't end when it gets dangerous. The mission ends when it's done or when you're dead. His voice escalated, echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. Tyrone Woods was on the roof of the CIA annex for 13 hours. 13 hours. He followed every protocol. He did everything right. He died waiting for help from the department you led. What difference does it make? That's what you said. Let me tell you what difference it makes, Madam Secretary. It makes the difference between a military that trusts its leadership and a military that doesn't. He pointed a firm, accusatory finger directly at her. When Marines say, "Leave no man behind," it isn't a slogan on a recruitment poster. It's a promise, a contract between the people who serve and the people who send them to serve. You broke that contract, and when you were asked about it, you asked what difference it made. The difference it makes is that 4 families had funerals, and the person responsible for their safety asked under oath why anyone was still asking about it. Confronted with an unbearable moral reckoning, Hillary Clinton physically flinched, instinctively turning her face a quarter turn away from the relentless camera lens, violently breaking eye contact for the very first time in the hearing. It was an incredibly telling physical surrender. Much like Nancy Pelosi had flinched from financial disclosures, Clinton was desperately looking away from the spectral names of the dead, names that carried a crushing, eternal weight that mere political scandals never could. One final section, Madam Secretary Vance announced, smoothly shifting back to his conversational Midwestern cadence, sensing the absolute climax rapidly approaching, the one that connects everything else. He methodically laid out the catastrophic architecture of the 2016 Russia collusion narrative. Without a hint of hesitation, he walked the spellbound committee through the undeniable, rigorously documented timeline. Her presidential campaign deliberately hiring the Perkins Coie law firm, which subsequently retained Fusion GPS, which in turn financed disgraced former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, to entirely fabricate the infamous, completely debunked Steele Dossier targeting Donald Trump. This is not disputed, Vance hammered home relentlessly. The Durham investigation confirmed the chain of funding. Your campaign paid for the creation of the Steele Dossier. That dossier became the basis for FISA surveillance warrants against an American citizen named Carter Page. He aggressively dismantled the systemic corruption, highlighting the 17 glaring errors uncovered by the Inspector General and the shocking reality of an FBI lawyer pleading guilty to federal crimes for maliciously altering crucial emails to secure illegal wiretaps. Your campaign created the predicate for the most consequential surveillance abuse in FBI history. You funded the research that was delivered to the FBI under false pretenses, Vance stated, his voice striking like a hammer on an anvil. The dossier you paid for was used to obtain warrants to surveil an American citizen. The warrants were built on fabricated intelligence. He paused, allowing the massive scope of the Democratic devastation to saturate the room. And the investigation that flowed from those warrants consumed 2 years of American political life, cost $32 million, and found no criminal conspiracy. But the damage went far beyond money and time. The Russia collusion narrative divided families. It ended friendships. It turned Thanksgiving tables into battlegrounds and made neighbors look at each other with suspicion. He glared down at her. And when that narrative collapsed, when Mueller found nothing, when Durham documented the fabrication, when the Inspector General confirmed the surveillance abuse, you didn't retract. You didn't apologize, you didn't pause, you did it again. He sharply reminded the committee how, in 2019, Clinton had casually smeared Tulsi Gabbard, a combat veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and fellow Democrat as a Russian asset being groomed for a third-party run on David Plouffe's podcast, completely devoid of intelligence or evidence, solely as vindictive retaliation for Gabbard endorsing Bernie Sanders. Director Gabbard, who is now the Director of National Intelligence, recently sat in a hearing room very much like this one and opened Senator Schiff's classified file on live television, Vance noted with deep satisfaction. She demonstrated precisely how the Russia collusion narrative was manufactured. To its origin, your campaign. You didn't just create a false narrative, Madam Secretary. You created a machine that produced false narratives. And even after the machine was exposed, you kept feeding it new targets. Vance stood up, his presence dominating the entire chamber. He subtly adjusted his tie one last time, the deeply symbolic gesture reminding everyone of his $12 goodwill origins before delivering his final catastrophic summation. Madam Secretary, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Wellesley, Yale Law, First Lady, Senator, Secretary of State, two-time presidential candidate. A resume that fills a page and a career that spans 4 decades, he recited. And yet, you called half of America deplorable from a fundraiser with Barbara Streisand, where the tables cost $250,000. You told coal miners you would put them out of business on national television. You called young black men super predators from a podium. You stored classified information on a private server in your basement. You deleted 33,000 emails with forensic-grade software. You oversaw a Haiti reconstruction that spent $4.4 billion and built 6 permanent homes. You received 600 security requests from Benghazi, and the compound fell and 4 Americans died. And you asked, what difference does it make? And you funded an opposition research dossier that became the basis for the most consequential surveillance abuse in FBI history. He stared down at her, his expression resolute. That's not a career, Madam Secretary, that's a pattern. And the pattern is always the same. Ordinary Americans pay the price, and you move on to the next fundraiser. Would you like to respond? Clinton instinctively adjusted her microphone. 40 years of elite political survival instincts rapidly activated, her mental machinery frantically searching for a pivot to Russia, to Trump, to the right-wing conspiracy. But every single escape route had been preemptively annihilated by the meticulously cited evidence Vance had just laid violently on the table. Mr. Vice President, I find it rich that an administration which she began before her voice suddenly halted mid-construction. She physically stopped, not from shock, but from the horrifying realization that her sentence had absolutely no viable destination. 10 agonizing seconds of absolute suffocating silence ensued. It was not mere blankness. It was the horrifying sound of an elite political processor running furiously on completely empty gears, her mouth open but incapable of producing a single defensive syllable because every word led straight into Vance's trap. The most powerful woman in American political history sat completely paralyzed in her chair, a live microphone catching nothing but dead air. Recognizing the total victory, Vance casually buttoned his jacket. Madam Secretary, I grew up deplorable. I'm still deplorable. The only thing that changed is the view, he stated calmly. With a polite nod to the stunned chairman, Vance turned and executed an unhurried, victorious exit, leaving the crushed Titan staring blankly at her untouched water glass in a room designed for her coronation, completely destroyed by her own horrific record. Within hours, 3 devastating clips dominated the global internet. Vance's iconic, the deplorable, is sitting up here, generated 200 million shares in 48 hours. Military communities aggressively amplified the furious Lance Corporal comparison, while the brutal arithmetic of 6 homes permanently stained her legacy on bumper stickers across the nation, instantly triggering sweeping Department of Justice reviews and ensuring her absolute plunge into permanent, unbearable irrelevance. As the dust completely settled on the absolute annihilation of Hillary Clinton's 40-year political dynasty, Vice President J.D. Vance quietly returned to his private office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. The term deplorable was no longer just a defiant bumper sticker from a bygone election. In the span of a single afternoon, Vance had successfully weaponized it into a formidable, unified political identity that absolutely terrified the Washington establishment. He had effectively armed the forgotten working class, the struggling steel workers like Tommy Blankenship, the devastated coal miners, the abandoned Haitian families like Marie Claire and Josette, with the razor-sharp receipts necessary to challenge their elite overlords. Yet, as Vance loosened his second nice suit tie and settled securely behind his heavy desk, fully aware that the DOJ's email review was now incredibly active, and the sprawling audit of the Clinton Foundation's activities in Haiti was rapidly expanding its investigative parameters. A red light began to flash rhythmically on his secure, heavily encrypted phone line. He stared at the blinking light, deeply knowing that the monstrous political machine he had just publicly humiliated was not entirely dead, and the vicious retaliation they were currently plotting in the shadows was about to unleash a storm far more terrifying than anyone in Washington could possibly anticipate. Vance's hand hovered over the receiver of the encrypted red phone, a secure line strictly reserved for the Oval Office and Tier 1 national security emergencies. It wasn't supposed to ring today. But before his fingers could even graze the heavy plastic, the massive mahogany doors of his office violently burst open. His chief of staff stood in the threshold, completely breathless, his face entirely drained of color, clutching a single, highly classified photograph. "Mr. Vice President," he stammered, his voice trembling with a raw, visceral terror. Vance hadn't witnessed since his combat deployments in the Marine Corps. They didn't just survive the hearing, sir. They used your victory as a distraction. The trap has already been sprung. Vance snatched the photograph from his aide's shaking hands, his blood running instantly cold as his eyes locked onto the image. The political machine hadn't targeted his career. They had targeted the one thing he couldn't protect. What horrific secret was captured in that single classified photograph? Who is the establishment's ultimate target? And how far will a desperate political machine go to silence the deplorables once and for all? The deep state's devastating counterattack has officially begun, and the stakes have just become fatally personal. Do not miss the explosive, heart-stopping next chapter. Smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and brace yourselves. Because the real war for America's soul didn't end in that committee room. It's just getting started.